You ever see two men step into a room like the walls owed them a favor just for standing there? Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes didn't just wear their badges, they wore the room too. Shoulders squared, chins up, those squad car keys jangling like spurs on boots that never touched dirt. Modesto, California wasn't big enough to be called dangerous by tourists, but for the people who lived in Southside Heights, it was big enough to swallow your voice if you screamed at the wrong people. Mark and Brian knew that. They'd spent 15 years shaping that silence. Mark started like every young recruit does, fresh uniform, starch still biting at his neck, rookie shine in his eyes. First year, he rode shotgun with old man Donnelly, who taught him how to fill out a report to look right, even when it wasn't right. "Listen, kid," Donnelly would grunt, cigarette half dead in his teeth, "this badge isn't about being honest. It's about keeping order. The city wants order more than it wants saints." Brian joined 2 years later, cockier than Mark but quick to learn who to laugh at, who to fear. They met on a Friday night shift, drunk college kids on 9th Street, wallets fat with their parents' cash, eyes wide when they saw the red and blues. Mark watched Brian lean into the window of a beat-up Civic, flashlight tapping the glass. "Got any weed in here, boys? Wanna donate to the station fund?" Brian laughed when the kids stuttered, made them pop their trunk, made them sweat. It wasn't about weed. It was about the reminder, we run this block, not you. By the end of their first year together, Mark and Brian had it down to muscle memory, the stops, the searches, the paperwork that turned half-truths into airtight facts. Nobody questioned it because nobody wanted to. Captains wanted numbers. Mayors wanted photo ops. And the neighborhoods that didn't matter? Well, they learned real fast not to expect the badge to protect them. Alicia Pearson didn't know any of this the first time her brother Dorian came home crying. She just saw blood on his cheek and a tear in his jeans. She was 25 then, still juggling night shifts at the county hospital and online classes at CSU. Dorian was 15, lanky, quiet, good with numbers, too young to understand how you can be guilty of existing. That night she sat him on the kitchen counter and cleaned his cut with peroxide. "What did they say to you?" she asked. "They said I looked like someone." "Who?" Dorian shrugged. He never did learn the name he was supposed to match. Mark and Brian filed that report like every other, suspicious activity. Subject fled. Released with warning. No camera. No paperwork glitch. No fuss. The complaint Alicia filed 2 days later didn't even make it past the front desk. A sergeant smiled at her like she was selling cookies instead of begging for answers. He nodded a lot, said, "We take these things seriously." He didn't. They didn't. They had beer with Mark and Brian that Friday. They laughed about crazy civilians. The city didn't see it, or maybe it chose not to. People see what they're willing to lose sleep over, and the truth is, Modesto could sleep just fine as long as the right people stayed scared. Southside Heights knew though. Kids learned the trick by middle school: don't run, don't talk back, don't reach for your phone. Men learned to stay inside after dark. Mothers learned to memorize badge numbers, even when they knew the number didn't mean help, it just meant who to avoid next time. One night, Mark leaned against his cruiser hood outside the 3rd precinct, cigarette burning to a nub between his fingers. Brian was inside sweet-talking a rookie, telling him how the system really worked. Mark stared at the streetlight across the lot, flickering like it couldn't make up its mind about shining. He thought about the first time he stopped a kid for no reason. It hadn't felt good, not exactly, more like a necessary flex. A reminder that power didn't have to ask permission. He told himself it kept order. He told himself a lot of things back then. Alicia didn't tell herself anything. She didn't have time for lies. Every paycheck went to bills, rent, Dorian's lunch money. Every shift at the hospital piled up beneath her eyes in half-moons of exhaustion. But she never missed Dorian's tutoring schedule. Never stopped asking, "You okay?" They leave you alone today? Dorian always said yes, even when it wasn't true. But truth has a way of lingering. Truth waits. Sometimes in grainy cell phone footage. Sometimes in memories that won't shut up at 3 a.m. Sometimes in people who refuse to sit down when they're told. Alicia didn't know she'd be that person yet. Not until the night the liquor store pavement scraped the skin off her brother's cheek and left the words, matched a description, echoing in her kitchen again. Only this time, Alicia had a receipt. A real one. And a voice that didn't care who told her to hush. Alicia Pearson didn't sleep much the night she got the GPS ping back from Dorian's tutor. It was a Wednesday. The hum of the fridge was the only sound in her apartment, that and Dorian's soft breathing from the bedroom they shared. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by open tabs on her laptop. Maps, timestamps, cell phone records, all proof that her brother hadn't been anywhere near that liquor store when Mark Callahan's report said he was. At 3:14 a.m., she called the local news tip line. At 4:02, she emailed the city's Civilian Oversight Committee, a page she found buried 3 clicks deep on the city's website, right under a photo of the mayor shaking hands with police brass. She didn't know if anyone would listen. What she knew was that if she stayed quiet, Dorian would learn what the rest of Southside Heights already knew: your silence is their currency. She wouldn't give them that. By Friday, a junior producer at Channel 9 emailed her back. "Can we talk?" the message read. It felt too easy. She said yes anyway. They met at a donut shop off Yosemite Avenue, somewhere neutral, nowhere near the station, nowhere near Southside Heights. The producer, Alondra Rivera, fresh out of college, wearing tired eyes and an eager smile, pressed a little red button on her recorder and asked Alicia to start from the beginning. Alicia did. She talked about the first time. The second. The third. She talked about the neighbor's kid who got a record for mouthing off. The man down the street who lost his job because he missed too many shifts after a weekend in holding. She didn't know all their names, but she knew the pattern. Alondra did too, or at least, she was starting to. When Alicia pulled out the screenshots, the tutor's message, the phone GPS, the timestamped texts, Alondra didn't say, "Wow," or "Unbelievable." She just nodded like she'd already known. "You're not the first to sit at this table with me," Alondra said, voice low. "You might be the first with proof they can't ignore." That night, the first clip ran on Channel 9's 10 o'clock news, 2 minutes of Alicia Pearson sitting stiff in her living room, Dorian just off camera, her voice calm but her eyes on fire. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just asked one question: if my brother's guilty of matching a description, how come nobody can say whose? Mark Callahan was at O'Leary's pub when the clip ran. He saw it out of the corner of his eye, sound muted, the bar TVs tuned to news and baseball and politics like background noise nobody actually cared about. At first he didn't even realize it was Alicia. By the time he did, Brian was already leaning back in his chair, smirking. "You see this? They'll forget it by Monday." Mark forced a laugh. But when he went home, he checked his email twice. Nothing yet. He told himself that was good news. He was wrong. Crescent Moon, the one who didn't stay gone. Celeste Jameson hadn't set foot in Modesto city limits for 5 years. Not since she boxed up her last case file, dropped her building pass on the city clerk's desk, and drove north with nothing but a trunk full of manila folders and a question that wouldn't leave her alone: how do you fix a house that refuses to see its own rot? Back then she'd been junior counsel for the city's legal division, the Internal Affairs Department's paper shield. Good at it too good, according to people who preferred her to keep her questions polite and her reports short. They called her a troublemaker. Her dad, back in Fresno, called her stubborn. She called herself necessary. But necessary didn't pay rent when the city locked its doors. So she left. She did contract work in Oakland, then Sacramento, civil suits, policy rewrites, audits that ended careers and made her plenty of enemies. She learned two things fast. 1. Paper trails never lie if you know how to follow them. 2. Silence is the easiest thing to buy in bulk. But every time she closed a file, she thought about Modesto, about the kids she'd seen sit in conference rooms too scared to speak, about the mothers in waiting rooms whose complaints turned to dust. She told herself she'd go back someday, when she had more than questions. When she had teeth. The email from Modesto's city attorney came in on a Thursday night, 3 days after Alicia's clip aired. Subject line, urgent oversight inquiry. The words were polite. The subtext wasn't. They didn't ask her if she'd come back. They asked how soon she could be in court. Celeste didn't answer right away. She opened an old folder on her laptop instead, one she hadn't touched since the day she left. Inside were names she hadn't spoken in years. Mark Callahan. Brian Stokes. Dates. Incident numbers. Questions that had been too inconvenient to chase down then. Now they felt like matchsticks in a dry field. She read through every line that night. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Fire a wire in the wall. By the time the internal memo went out, all active lawsuits involving officer conduct to be overseen by Celeste Jameson, ESQ, the news was already buzzing in back hallways of the 3rd Precinct. Most officers ignored it. Some muttered that the city was just covering its ass. Mark read it twice, his coffee going cold beside him. He didn't say anything to Brian that morning. Brian didn't ask. He was too busy charming a reporter who'd come to the station looking for a quote, telling him about community engagement, modern policing, the same lines he'd polished for years. He didn't see Mark, standing at his locker later, staring at the email again like maybe if he read it enough times, the words would apologize and go away. Internal Affairs didn't knock on their doors right away. It never does. It waits. It listens for squeaks in the walls, the pipes rattling, the hush that comes when the backroom deals stop working. The hush was coming. Inside her rented office, a bare room in a strip mall across from a payday loan shop, Celeste spread her old files across a cheap folding table. She highlighted, cross-checked, made calls to people who didn't know her favors but answered anyway. She tracked names she remembered, not the ones who got promotions, but the ones who vanished into desk jobs when they spoke too loud. She found Renee Lalston's number in an old notebook, a rookie back then, now a mid-career patrol officer whose voice on the phone was wary but not surprised. "I always knew you'd come back," Renee said, after a long silence. "I never left," Celeste said. And for the first time in a long time, it felt true. Bell the gathering. Alicia kept pushing. When Channel 9's clip faded from the nightly cycle, she showed up at City Hall with a copy of the lawsuit paperwork. When a city clerk tried to tell her the forms were incomplete, she sat in the lobby with her brother beside her until someone from legal came down to take the folder by hand. When the protest started, small at first, 24 people outside the precinct with homemade signs, Alicia didn't stand at the front. She stood behind them, next to Dorian, her hand on his shoulder, a reminder that this time they weren't leaving until the story was told all the way through. The first time Celeste stepped into Modesto's Superior Court since she left, she didn't wear a suit from the city's budget. She wore one she'd paid for herself, dark navy, pressed crisp, a pen clipped to the inside pocket next to a folded note she'd written the night she resigned 5 years ago. A single line, "You can bury truth but you can't keep it dead." Outside, the courthouse steps were filling with more signs than anyone had planned for: "Justice for Southside, we are Dorian, silence is compliance." None of it loud yet. But it was a different kind of noise now, not the aimless chant that dies at dusk, but a steady, waiting hum. Like thunder that knows exactly when it's going to break. Inside, the clerk checking Celeste's name at the door gave her a look she knew well, polite, uncomfortable, a little too fast to say good morning. People always look like that when they see someone they thought they'd never have to see again. Celeste just nodded, took her file, and stepped through the metal detector. Mark and Brian arrived later, separate cars this time. Brian pulled up in his usual black SUV, music low, sunglasses on even though the sun hadn't cleared the county building's shadow yet. He liked the armor of it, the look that told reporters I'm too important to worry. He'd practiced it for years. But even armor makes you sweat if you wear it too long. Mark sat in his truck 2 rows back in the staff lot. He hadn't slept. He'd stared at the ceiling until dawn, half listening for his phone to buzz, the captain, the union, someone to say this was still fixable. But the phone stayed dark. And when he finally turned the key in his ignition, he realized he'd left his badge on the kitchen counter. He turned back for it. Not because he needed it in court, but because walking in without it felt like stepping onto ice without shoes. Balance scale the opening. Courtroom 4B was older than it looked from the street. The paint on the walls peeled in thin seams near the corners. The wood paneling behind the judge's bench gleamed like it was cleaned too often, a shine to distract from the scuffs you couldn't buff out. Everything about it felt like a promise the city kept forgetting to keep. Alicia sat in the front row. Dorian beside her, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on a crack in the tile floor. He'd wanted to stay home. Alicia didn't let him. She needed him to see this, really see. That this time their voices wouldn't die in a hallway filing cabinet. Celeste stood near the clerk's table, flipping through the tabs on her binder. She didn't look at Mark or Brian when they came in. She didn't need to. She knew the way the air shifted, the way power changes its shape when it realizes it's bleeding. Judge Harville called them to order with a voice that barely rose above a whisper but landed like a hammer. He was old school, the kind who wore the same robe his predecessor wore, the kind who thought routine was half the law. But even he could feel it, the thing in the room that wasn't routine anymore. A different hum behind every word. Open file folder Celeste's files. Celeste spoke first. Not loud, just clear. She laid out the pattern in short, cutting lines. 32 complaints. 11 different community statements. 5 former officers who asked for reassignment or quit outright. And one paper trail so clean in its edits it looked like it had been run through a shredder with a heartbeat. The judge asked once, "Is this speculation?" Celeste didn't flinch. She clicked a remote. The projector hummed to life. A cell phone video filled the wall, Dorian's face, the liquor store pavement, Mark's boots just inches from the boy's head. The room went silent except for Alicia's breath, fast, shallow, like she was holding in all the words she'd swallowed for years. Brian leaned back, arms folded tight across his chest, but his foot tapped at the floor, faster and faster the longer Celeste spoke. Mark didn't move. He stared at the screen, then at his hands, then at the badge clipped to his belt, like maybe it would stand up and defend him if he looked sorry enough. Megaphone outside. By noon, the courthouse steps were packed. Not just Southside Heights this time. A news van from Sacramento. 2 reporters from Fresno. A local podcast crew huddled near the edge, recording interviews with old men in faded work jackets and teenagers who'd skipped first period just to hold a sign that said, "Who's next?" Alicia stepped outside during recess, stood at the top of the stairs, Dorian at her side. She didn't have a megaphone. Didn't need one. When a reporter shoved a mic in her face and asked, "What do you want from this?" she answered without blinking. "I want them to know they don't get to keep the air we breathe." Magnifying glass tilted left the whistleblowers. Inside, Celeste didn't slow down. She called Renee Alalston to the stand first, the once rookie who learned fast that if you wrote the wrong truth in your report, it vanished before shift change. Renee didn't look at Mark or Brian when she raised her right hand. She looked at Alicia. At Dorian. At the empty rows where she knew families would be watching the local broadcast from folding chairs in living rooms all over Southside. Her testimony wasn't long. It didn't need to be. One incident. One report. One conversation in a precinct hallway when she'd asked why her report never got filed. "It's above your pay grade, rookie. Keep your nose clean or you'll lose your place." She remembered every word. So did Celeste. So did the court recorder, tapping the keys like nails into a coffin. Collision the pressure point. Brian broke first. It happened just after lunch, when Celeste played the dispatch audio from a night 3 years back, a call Brian had flagged as unfounded but that the GPS ping showed him parked blocks away, nowhere near where he said he was chasing a suspect. The judge asked a simple question: "Is the dispatch record wrong, Officer Stokes?" Brian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Mark whispered, "Say it's a glitch." But the words stuck in Brian's throat. Years of swagger dissolved into a dry click of his tongue against his teeth. He looked small. Smaller than the badge on his belt. Endero the silence cracks. When the judge called recess again, Mark stayed in his seat while Brian slipped into the hallway, tie loose, breath ragged like he'd just run laps in the rain. Mark didn't bother chasing him. He just sat there, shoulders hunched, hands limp on the table. He thought about the nights they'd laughed about civilians with cameras. About the times they'd leaned against squad cars, telling rookies, "Don't worry, the game's rigged for us." He thought about the look Celeste gave him when she flipped that first file open. Like she'd been waiting 5 years for him to blink first. Outside, the crowd didn't chant. They waited. That was worse. Because noise you can drown out. Silence. Silence is a spotlight. It shines on what you want to bury. And this time, the dirt was too thin.